now we're boosting the nuclear threat from the standpoint of NATO. Then you got B-52s that are flying up to the territorial limits of Russia, forcing Russians to scramble jets to come after. This is like you got a guy that's in a gunpowder magazine lighting up cigarettes. Something bad's going to happen. Well, and look, the Russians are sitting there saying, okay, Ukraine's in our backyard. What the hell are you doing in Syria? You've had troops in Syria now for 10 years. Well, actually 12 years. What are you doing? And yeah, when they get killed, you get all upset, the United States. So, this kind of hypocrisy, it just stinks to high heaven. And the United States refuses to come to grips with the reality that we're the ones creating the provocation. And people say, oh, Johnson, you're a hate America kind of guy. No, I'm not a hate America kind of guy, but I can step back and look at it rationally. If Russia had spent the last 16 years conducting an annual naval and military exercise on land in Mexico and in the Caribbean, where Russian Marines were landing on Mexican beaches up around Veracruz, for example, and they were doing this year after year, we would be concerned. We would view that as a threat, a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. We'd view that as a threat to us as a country. And yet, we turn around and we have done that in the Black Sea up until 2021, from 2007 to 2021, and we're going, what's the problem with these Russians? God, they're sensitive.
We're a defensive alliance. We're not offensive. Yeah. We don't have a threat to anyone.
Yeah, and explain to me how Marines coming off of a landing craft is a defensive operation. When you look at, Tarawa, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, as I seem to recall, those were more like offensive. Oh yeah, no, they've reached they're past the fed up point. Now, just a side comment. I sure wish that John Kirby and Joe Biden were as concerned about the U.S. southern border and protecting it as they are about protecting Ukraine's border with Russia, for God's sake. I mean, good Lord. They're given more money, more attention, more weapons to protect a border that's thousands of miles away and not protect our own. And you're correct. The Russian, if you've watched and listened to and we talked about this even when I was on your program from St. Petersburg, it was that week it was the week of June 3rd. That was the week that Putin, Lavrov, so the presidency and the foreign ministry, their tone changed. They did it's almost like a 180. There was no more, they eliminated the ambiguity. They established very clearly that they think that, they keep they're warning now the United States. You're poking us in the chest. We're not going to take it. We're going to punch back. We're going to provide weapons to people that are attacking you. We're going to make your life miserable. If you follow through on what you're talking about doing and equipping Ukraine to attack us in our country, we're coming back at you. And they made that very clear. They didn't mince words about it. And that's what Putin was very direct about in his comments last Friday when he spoke before the foreign ministry, or maybe that was Thursday. But there was no ambiguity there. And then to top it off, sort of the icing on the cake, was Medvedev, the former president. He was blistering, just absolutely blistering in what he posted. And so, and none of the Western media is reporting on that. They're pretending like it doesn't exist. And Putin's under a lot of domestic political pressure to do more, to hit back harder. That, he's not leading the way on this. He's actually restraining the popular sentiment in Russia.
Yeah, I wonder if you could go down that path for a little bit, because we often hear that Putin is Hitler, he's the evil guy, so he's the one leading all this. But then I know I've heard you in the past say that he's actually quite restrained from what others in the Russian sphere want to do. And that you don't want him to be out because he could be replaced by somebody even further to the right. I wonder if you could explain how that works.
Yeah, I've not seen the show myself, but I've talked with Pepe Escobar, who has. And there are different, they have multiple television channels in Russia. It's not, just one channel. They've got, like the good old days when there were more than one network in the United States. And on all of those networks, they have talk shows. And on all of those talk shows, they have legislators, members of the Duma, they have governors, they have common citizens. All are agitating for much stronger action against the United States and against NATO. Attacks to retaliate for killing the civilians in Belgorod. So, and what Putin definitely signaled last week is, we're going to do that. They're not so, and I don't think the West is prepared for that because we've convinced ourselves they're bluffing. But it's one thing to be playing poker when you all you're risking is 50 cents, 2 quarters, and you're bluffing with that. Okay, you can afford to lose that. They're bluffing with nuclear weapons here. The example of the incompetence of the Biden administration. I worked during the Reagan administration. I worked during the George H.W. Bush administration, and even some during the Bill Clinton administration. And all three, despite their political differences, still had some measure of message discipline where they weren't sending mixed signals about what our policy was, what our objectives were. I mean, and look here, just you compare what Matt Miller said with what Jack Sullivan. Miller had it at 90 countries. Now it's over 100 countries are at that summit. My God, the whole world was at the summit. There was 100, the numbers keep escalating. And instead of dealing with the reality, I said, no, we couldn't get everybody, most of the world didn't show up, and we didn't get even the important countries. We can't say that. So this kind of mixed signals, and the foreigners. I was involved several years ago in training what was called a senior crisis management seminar, and so the members of a foreign government would come to the United States, and we would run a seminar on crisis management for it. And I kept running into this is right after we had invaded Iraq in 2003. And I'm talking countries from Latin America, from Europe, and from Asia, and from the Middle East. It wasn't just one. Every single one of these countries would pull, one member or other would pull me aside after, I did the lecture and go, okay, tell us the truth. What's the U.S. purpose here in Iraq? What are you really trying to do? Because they assumed that we had some secret plan because they knew that they lied to us and that they wouldn't always tell us the truth. So they figured we're lying to them. And I had to say to them, I said, no, guys, we really haven't thought this through. There is no broad strategic plan behind this. We're just sort of making it up as we go. And they were like shocked. And so when they're listening to what Sullivan and now Kirby are saying, their heads got to be spinning around like, the girl in the Exorcist movie. And so Ukraine, the North Koreans have got their technical personnel. They're embedded with the Russians as they fire ballistic missiles and other missile systems, tracking how they operate and seeing how are they as accurate as they were engineered, designed to be. That's number one. Number two, Putin's going to make good on his threat that if the West starts hitting inside Russia, North Korea is going to have everything it needs from Russia. Russia's got technically superior weapon systems than North Korea. North Korea's got a lot of quantity, but Russia's got a lot of quality. So, this game that's being played from a diplomatic standpoint, where the global South is following up, and like I said, just compare and contrast. At the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, 136 countries, and that is not an exaggeration. Compare that with what they got at Birkenstock. I couldn't believe they have a city in Switzerland named after those clunky shoes. But
but yeah, that's what that is.
Yeah.
Gary, I wonder if I could ask you to pull up something in a minute here. If you could pull up that Biden conversation with Zelensky, and I think it was the 5th or the 6th of June, where he was listing of that we're going to stay there forever. If you could grab that, I want to show that in just a second, because you just said something that spurred got my memory. You talked about the contrast in imagery. And so we just talked about it here a little bit, and we're going to talk about it again in a second. But when people see even not just the countries or the governments, but the heads of state, you're seeing a couple of contrasts that is not playing well for us. And you're not the only one I've had on this show talking about this, but I keep hearing that whether you're talking about large parts of Asia, the global South, Africa, South America, et cetera, even now encroaching parts of the Middle East, our reputation and credibility is just falling further and further into the dirt. And Russia's is rising at the same time, in large measure because of all these, problems that we're having, all this contradictory messaging, seeking after things that are self-evidently not going to happen. They're never going to happen. And then when you look at the heads of state, first of all, I want to show you, this is what Putin said. I think it was last Thursday when he was listing where he stands on what could be an actual peace. Actually, we don't have that one, I guess. You don't have the Russian one there, Gary? It's coming. All right. So I threw a curveball there when he was looking for a slider. So that's on me. But this is something we had to do a little audible here. But this is something you're going to want to see. But before I show that, I wonder if you can tell me your view, Larry, about what the global South is actually thinking, and is that something we need to worry about? Because a lot in America will say they're the second and third tier anyway, so they don't really matter.
Well, again, the U.S. approach with the global South has been one of threat. We threaten them. We're not enticing them. We're not romancing them. We're not buying them candies and bottles of wine to say, hey, come be our friend. We're telling them, if you don't do what we say, we're going to impose economic sanctions on you. Oh, hey, Angola, you passed this law that's what we view as anti-LGBTQ, so therefore we're going to impose some economic sanctions on you. And these countries are going, what the hell? Who do these Americans think they are, that they can come in and tell us what to do? And then what they encounter with the Russians is the Russians are not telling them what they need to think, how they need to act, what they need to say. The Russians are treating them saying, oh, hey, what are your views? What are your thoughts? They get treated equally like that. But they're also seeing the images. What we saw with Biden at Normandy on June 6th, where they're watching that parachute demonstration, and he starts wandering off, and the Prime Minister of Italy, Meloni, has to run over and fetch him to keep him from, going away. They see that. And, when those world leaders are in a room with Biden, they sense, I had an experience several years ago with one of the original members of SEAL Team 6 when Marcinko set that up. And he was now out. We'd been working together and exercising, and I was with another friend of mine who was an Africa specialist in the military. And so when we met with Norm, boy, he was forgetful. He was forgetting names. He was showing all signs of, and he was only 62. He was showing signs of early dementia, and he died a few years later of Alzheimer's. And we attributed it to, apparently he'd had some brain injuries when he was with the team. The point was, when we met with him, we knew, Dell and I knew, talking to Norm, that there was a real problem, but you didn't feel comfortable telling him that he had a problem. And even if we told him, we're not sure he would have understood. Well, that's what's happening with Biden right now. And I mean, and this is no joke. When the rest of the world sees that, and if you're the Russians and you recognize The United States has a guy that's not mentally competent, supposedly in charge. The real question comes up, who is in charge? Yeah, no, exactly. And notice so Putin was reading that particular speech. He normally doesn't read a speech. And he doesn't even use a teleprompter. He normally will speak extemporaneously. But the message he was delivering there was specifically the Russian peace plan proposal. And his reading it was sending a message that they were being very precise, that he wasn't making this up on the fly. He wasn't speaking off the cuff. This is what Russia policy was clearly. Whereas, in contrast with Biden, yeah, he's reading off his note cards what they told him to say. And with that monotone, flat voice, you nailed it, Danny. All you got to do is start marketing that on Amazon as, hey, are you having trouble sleeping at night? Just simply play this tape before you go to bed, man. You'll be out in, 5 minutes. Because it is just, I testified before Biden on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, good Lord, 22 years ago. That's not the Joe Biden I remember. He could be animated and his voice would be, but nothing like that. Yeah. And the rest of the world sees it. It's just, it's not healthy. And again, I come back to the point. If you're the foreign intelligence chief and you're being asked by Putin to say, okay, who's making the decisions in the U.S. government? I honest to God couldn't tell you. I mean, we can speculate. We can come up with, we think it's this, we think it's that. But if Biden's the real decision maker, that's alarming because he's not sure where he is half the time. Or is it some other group? And if it's that group, then you go back to what you'd presented earlier, where you got John Kirby saying one thing and Jake Sullivan saying the other. Well, Sullivan supposedly is in charge of the National Security Council, and Kirby works for him, and yet Kirby's saying something completely different from Sullivan. So who's the conductor leading this orchestra, or what we faced with is just a jazz band where everybody's doing their own thing, because what Russia is doing is they're moving slowly and methodically. But the reason for that is, one, they're trying to minimize casualties, but two, they're forcing Ukraine into having to bring forces to the front. And as they bring them along their lines of communication, the Russians are hitting and attacking them and destroying them in many cases. Plus, they've now stretched the line in a way that it was always this, 1,000-kilometer long line, but Russia was not attacking at the same time all along the line a year ago like they are now. They are doing that now because both they have the manpower and the reserves in place to do it, as well as the supplies. So it is like that situation, if you think back to your kids' birthday parties, if you're blowing a balloon up and you keep blowing, you're going to reach a point where that balloon pops because you have stretched it beyond its capability to retain what it has. The air inside, and that's what I think the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians. They're forcing them to stretch their capabilities and degrading them in the process, degrading NATO militarily in the process, because NATO keeps pouring in this equipment that it can't replace. It would be one thing if they had the factories up and running throughout the United States and in Germany and in England that were cranking out this new materiel, vehicles and tanks and artillery and howitzers, but they're not. They just simply don't have that capability. They're looking at it, they're years away from being able to do that. So from Russia's standpoint, everything you can do to force them to expand their arsenal against you and take it out and weaken it is less that you're going to have to worry about down the line.
And do you see any prospect or any signs at all that Russia could have a hard time at some point, that the trough of recruits that have been coming in above what they have been losing in combat could slow down? Do you see any possibility of that?
Not at this juncture, in part because the elevated rhetoric from the West, which is so belligerent and talking about attacking and destroying Russia, it's building support for Putin. It's building support for the military effort. It's not debilitating them. And so that's the one thing that neither Russia nor the Ukrainians can control and clamp down on. And that's why you keep seeing out of Ukraine all these videos popping up of Ukrainian recruitment efforts where they're dragging guys kicking and screaming off the streets. But also on that social media platforms, you're seeing for all these freshly dug graves. I mean, hundreds and just different pictures. And you're not seeing that on the Russian side. And it's not because Russia's clamping down and not allowing that. It's because it's not existing in the numbers that the Ukrainians are suffering. The Ukrainians are suffering World War II type of casualties, what the Soviets suffered at the hands of the Germans early on. And, that with enormous losses. But Russia so far has not been incurring that because the general staff have made it a point. They're not doing mass casualty assaults, and the units that have suffered most of the casualties in these battles have been